Hello everyone, in this video we're going to be discussing Amazon S3 core concepts. If you're just getting started with AWS and you need to learn about S3, then this is the video for you. I'm not going to go through every single concept of S3, but I'm just going to tell you about the most important ones that you need to know about. So let's jump right into it. First of all, I want to discuss in broad strokes what is Amazon S3. So S3 stands for Simple Storage Service. That's where the three S's come from. It was originally launched in 2006 as AWS's first service. Now, since 2006, things have come a long way. There's been a whole bunch of new features that have been added, but really the general premise of the service has stayed the same. And the core functionality of S3 is that it's focused on general object storage that exists on the cloud, and it takes advantage of AWS's cloud infrastructure. Now, I like to think of S3 as something similar to maybe Google Drive or Dropbox, something like that, in the sense that you can literally use it to store anything. However, I do think that S3 is more tailored towards object storage for software-oriented applications. After all, we are using AWS, so just keep that in mind. However, you can really use it for anything that you want. Now, in terms of content that you can store on S3, like I said, you can really do anything. You can store big files up to 5 terabytes in size, small files, media content, source code, spreadsheets, emails, whatever you really want, you can store on S3. So really, it's like the kitchen sink for dumping file content, and at that, it's very, very affordable in terms of pricing. And we're going to be going into the pricing model a little bit later, but the pricing factor is very attractive. It's very cheap to store large amounts of data for long periods of time. Now, in terms of the performance characteristics of S3 and why it's a good idea to use, well, it's advertised as very highly scalable for applications that have very high throughput. So you can build microservices that need to store objects in S3 and have very low latencies when trying to put objects or even get objects from S3. It's also highly available, so AWS behind the scenes will replicate your data on S3 into different data centers all across the region that you have it associated with, so that even if one goes down, the data will still be accessible from a different region. It has high durability guarantees, so you don't have to worry about data loss. This is another very attractive factor. And what I think is the most important, or maybe perhaps the most interesting of S3, is the fact that it supports integrations with AWS. And this is really where a lot of the magic happens. You can build some very sophisticated application architectures by leveraging S3 and integrating it with all these different AWS services. I'm going to give you some concrete examples a little bit later on, but just in broad strokes, here are a couple. So it's useful in a variety of different contexts. So I have 3 of them listed here for you. So the first one is website hosting. You can use S3 to store content, like static content for your website. This can include HTML, CSS, JavaScript, image files, anything else that you need for websites. You can also use it for things like database backups. This is a very common thing that people need to do periodically, maybe once a night or once a week. You can take a snapshot of your database, store it in S3, and then just have a copy that you can keep there for a long period of time. And a more interesting example is that you can build data processing pipelines. So you can ingest large volumes of data through some kind of architecture that you build, dump that all in S3, and even transform it after it arrives in S3 by hooking into certain events that get emitted. So there's a whole bunch of different use cases in which leveraging S3 is appropriate, and we're going to get to some more examples a little bit later in the video. So that was just some general background information of S3. I want to move on now to some of the core concepts that you're going to need to know about if you're going to be working with S3. So the first core concept, perhaps the most important one, is this concept of buckets. So a bucket is really just a container of objects that you want to store within a certain namespace. So when you create a bucket, you need to give it a name in a similar way where you would create a folder on a file system. And that bucket name needs to be globally unique. There can't be 2 buckets with the same name. So if I create a bucket called Be a Better Dev, you cannot create a bucket called Be a Better Dev. So that is one of the constraints that you should probably know about right out of the gate. Now, in terms of what buckets represent, now I like to think of buckets just as a general purpose file system. The bucket itself is the top level folder, and then within the bucket, you can have subfolders, you can have files at different levels of the subfolders, or even at the root level. It's really up to you. So you can organize your bucket in a wide variety of different ways, depending on your use case. Now, the second core concept is, as you would assume, something called objects, and objects are just the content that you're storing inside of your buckets. Now, this can include a wide variety of different files types like we discussed earlier. So this can include media content such as videos or images. It can include JSON files or CSV files or whatever you want to put in there. It can also include like SDKs or jars or zip files that are useful for your applications to actually boot up. So there's a whole bunch of different things that you can store in there, but the TLDR of it is really that you create buckets, which are like folders, and then you put objects inside of those buckets, and those are going to persist throughout time. Now, I do want to point out that in terms of objects, there is a maximum size, which is 5 terabytes. It's a very, very large size, as you would imagine. So that should satisfy most use cases. So in terms of access, there's a couple different ways that you can retrieve your content from S3. The first one is by URL, and this is what an example of an object that you're trying to access via a URL may look like. So it's just an HTTP URL, so it's s3.amazonaws.com. That string there is fixed, and depending on the bucket name that comes after the first /, and then you can have your object name, which comes after the second one. That's just a quick-hand way in which you can access the content that's in S3. Now, keep in mind, if you're trying to access your content through URLs, this will only work if your S3 bucket is publicly exposed. By default, public access is not enabled, so this method can only really be used in a subset of circumstances. There are a wide variety of other ways to access content, which we'll get to in a moment here. So the second way is probably the more common way, which is programmatically. I assume that a lot of you are trying to build applications that want to leverage S3, and this is how you would do it if you want to just do a very basic get object request. So this is using Python's Boto3 SDK, which is what you use to interact with AWS services. So in that first line, I'm just instantiating an S3 client using the Boto3 library. And in that second line, I'm assigning a variable called myObject to the result of S3 client's getObject method. And then I'm just passing in the bucket name, and then I'm passing in the key. The key is just the object name. So whatever your name of your object that you're uploading to S3, that's what you'd put in the key section there. So it's pretty trivial. There's really not a lot to it in terms of interacting with S3. There's also some other methods if you want to do this through the AWS console. And let me just bring up a quick little example to show you what that looks like. So if you're interacting with AWS through the console, this is what the bucket section looks like of my personal account. So you can see there's a whole bunch of different buckets here. And if I just get my mouse really quick, there we are. You can see these are the bucket names. This is the region that it was originally created in. This is the access policy that's associated with it. So you can see objects can be public in this case, and then the creation date. You'll notice this one at the bottom here does have public access enabled, and AWS does a pretty good job of making it very clear which buckets are publicly accessible. Now, if I were to click on any one of these buckets, I can see the content of those buckets in terms of the objects. So if I were to click on my bottom bucket here of AWS Simplified, we would be brought to the object section. And you can see now these are all the objects that are stored within this bucket. So we have a couple different things here. We have some just raw image files here. We have some JSON files here. We have the types that get associated with it. Similarly, we also have the modification date and the size of those objects, depending on if it's in kilobytes, bytes, gigabytes, or terabytes. And then we also have the folder, so we can have subfolders within our S3 bucket. So we have one called static, and this, if we double click on this, that'll also contain more content. But that's the general idea of using S3 through the console. You're going to be interacting with it through the UI. All right, so that's pretty much it in terms of access and examples and core concepts. I do want to talk about some other important areas. And the first one is something called S3 storage classes. Now, originally when S3 came out, this wasn't really a thing. There was only one storage class that you can use, and there was only one pricing model. Over time, since S3 is used in such a wide variety of different ways, from applications that are going to write data and require access to it immediately with very low latencies and high availability guarantees, that has a very different performance characteristics as opposed to someone that wants to store data in S3 that has very infrequent access. So AWS has recognized this problem, and as a result allows you to classify buckets and objects into different storage classes that have different characteristics. So firstly, storage classes allow you to reduce costs, but that comes with certain sacrifices. So there's a variety of different storage classes that exist, and generally as you go down the list, your cost gets lower, but things like availability and latencies tend to suffer. This goes back to my original point. If you need high availability and low latency, you'll go with some of the more standard cost models or the standard storage classes. But if you have cold data, maybe archive data or stuff that you never really need to access, you'll go with some of the other storage classes which are more suited to that use case. Now, some of the examples of the storage classes include standard, which is just the default one. It's got excellent availability, very low latency, supports very high throughput to buckets and objects. There's also an intelligent tier, which can kind of shuffle around your data based on how you're accessing it. This is all automated and done by AWS on your behalf. Then there's also infrequent access, which is stuff that's getting a little bit older that you may not need to access very often, but when you do, you still need some level of availability and latency guarantees. And then finally, there's Glacier and an additional one called Deep Glacier, which is more suited towards that archiving use case. Now, keep in mind, if you're using those models or those storage classes, there's going to be delays in accessing your data from minutes to even hours. Keep in mind the cost is greatly reduced as well, so that's one of the benefits. Now, like I was kind of alluding to, each tier has different pricing, latency guarantees, and availability guarantees. Keep in mind that the pricing is quite good across all of the storage classes. The latency tends to vary widely depending on the storage classes, and the availability is also pretty consistent in the 99.9 range. So it's all like quite good, but there are some subtle differences that you may need to know about. So as an example of how you can leverage storage classes to reduce your costs in your application, we can use a dynamic model to shift our data into different storage classes over time, depending on the age of our data. So as a quick example, here's one here. We may want to, when we originally upload our data into S3, just use the standard tier, and I call this hot data. Generally, in most applications, data that is most recently uploaded, more likely than not, will need more frequent access. And stuff that's a little bit older will have less frequent access. So the general pattern is the fresher the data, the more often you need to access it. The older the data, the less often you need to access it. So we can take advantage of that characteristic of most applications by cycling our S3 objects through these different storage classes to reduce our costs. So we can originally put it in the standard tier, which has high guarantees for latency, availability, and all those bells and whistles. Then maybe after a month or so, we can put it into infrequent access because that data may not need to be accessed very frequently at all. So we can lower our costs by moving it to that tier. And then if we have very old data, maybe after 6 months or so, or maybe even a year, we can move it into Glacier or even Deep Glacier. And this is where you're going to store all your archive data, all the stuff that you may need to keep around just for compliance or policy reasons, but you don't necessarily want to get rid of completely. So that'll be at a much lower cost at the sacrifice of performance. Now, the nice thing is you don't need to worry about doing all of this stuff manually. What you can do is leverage lifecycle rules which automate the data movement process. So these rules allow you to specify after an object gets uploaded, how long should it stay in a certain tier. So for example, you can say that when it originally gets uploaded, it should be in standard tier. After 30 days, it should move to infrequent access. And after maybe 90 days or even longer, it should move to Glacier. All of this is completely automated for you. So once you configure it on the bucket level or even the object level, this will automatically happen without any effort of your own. A really neat way to automate this process and make your life easier and save some money in the process. All right, so that's about it for storage classes. I want to talk to you now about security. And security is one of those things in S3 that is quite important. And just to demonstrate why it's important, I just briefly typed into Google S3 data leaks, and there were a whole bunch of different headlines that came up, and I collected a couple of them that I wanted to show to you here. Often these things happen in the news because usually it's large companies that leak their data. I'm sure this happens to a lot of smaller companies too, but these are some of the headlines that I pulled up. The first one, leaky S3 bucket at the center of data breach. The second one, unsecured S3 bucket found leaking data of 30,000 customers. And the third one, US municipalities suffered data breach due to misconfigured S3 bucket. Now, since S3 can be used in a wide variety of different use cases, you can use it to store very sensitive, personally identified information. You can use it to store customer data, credit card data, whatever you really want. The settings on your S3 bucket really do matter because unfortunately, if you're not careful, you can expose your S3 bucket to the public and these data breaches can happen. Now, thankfully, S3 has made this a little bit more difficult for you to make mistakes as of late in response to all of these different very high profile news events like we're seeing in front of us here. So they added a lot more friction to the process when you're trying to make your content public, just as a way to protect yourself. I have a couple points that I wanted to raise here in terms of security. So the first thing that you need to know about security in terms of S3 is that public access is blocked by default. When you're going through the wizard of creating your S3 bucket, there's some options that you need to select. By default, those options make your S3 bucket private, so only you, the account owner, can access the content within your bucket. So this is a really good thing to know about, and S3 makes it very, very clear to you when your bucket is publicly accessible. Like we saw in the screenshot earlier of the console, we had that big red text which was telling us that this S3 bucket is indeed publicly accessible. Now, in terms of security, there's a whole bunch of different lenses in which you can look at security. So I just wanted to cover a couple different items here really quickly just to teach you the fundamentals. So the first one is data protection. Now, S3 objects are highly durable and there's availability guarantees. In fact, I think the durability guarantee is 99.119 after the decimal point there. So the likelihood of you losing your data is pretty much slim to none. And in terms of availability, I know the standard tier offhand, that guarantees 99.99% availability guarantees. So that's the SLA that you're dealing with. Now, it also supports encryption in transit and at rest. So while it's flowing into S3 over the wire, and when it's eventually stored in the S3 bucket, it can be encrypted. These are configurable options that you can play with to protect your data. The second one is in terms of access. Now, access and resource-based controls are managed through AWS Identity and Access Management, or IAM for short. IAM is a very foundational service. It is the service to use in terms of guarding your AWS resources, and S3 is no exception. In fact, I have a whole video on IAM, so if you don't know much about it and you want to learn more, which I'll link in the description section below. But essentially, you can set up your S3 buckets and objects with IAM so that users can only access certain buckets and certain files within those buckets. So you can create groupings of different users that have different permission controls to protect some sensitive buckets and expose some other ones to only a subset of users that exist on that account. The third one is in terms of auditing. Now, AWS natively supports access logs. It also supports action-based logs through AWS CloudTrail. It also supports alarms. So if you have a certain number of GET requests on a certain bucket or object, you can set up alarms that they fire after a certain period of time or a certain number of invocations and get like an email or get a page or just get notified in general if something is happening that you don't expect. So you can set that up with AWS CloudWatch to get notified of those circumstances. And the final one is just a general one. You're leveraging the infrastructure security that is built on top of the AWS cloud infrastructure. There's data centers that exist all throughout the world with AWS, and there's back channels between the data centers that are not exposed to the public internet. So really by using S3, you get to piggyback on top of that infrastructure, which provides an additional layer of security. All right, so that's about it in terms of security. I want to move now to talk about some of the more interesting things about S3 and how you can use it to achieve some really cool things. And I like to say that S3 is more than just storage. In fact, it is a lot more than just storage. I know that's what S3 is generally advertised for, but that's really a drop in the bucket in terms of where S3 comes in the general AWS ecosystem. So it turns out that you can do some pretty incredible things by leveraging S3. So let's run through some different examples here. So the first one is, say we have a data ingestion pipeline, or we want to build a data ingestion pipeline to consume some stock market data. Now, what we can do is we can have, we need to hook into a data stream that has stock market data, obviously, but we can integrate that with a service called Amazon Kinesis Data Firehose. And basically, Firehose is a service that allows you to ingest large volumes of data very, very rapidly and allows you to batch that data into chunks. So if we have independent events of price movements of stocks coming in at every second for all these different stock tickers we're interested in, we can write those into our Kinesis Firehose endpoint. And after we get up to, say, 5 megabytes worth of data, we can deliver that automatically to S3. So every time our data stream gets 5 megabytes worth of data, we're just going to dump it into S3 over and over and over again. And Firehose automatically scales based on the amount of incoming data. So it's completely serverless, completely elastic, and it integrates very, very well with S3. All of this is done automatically, just with a couple clicks in the console. It's completely configuration based. And one of the neat things that I didn't really talk about earlier, but I want to cover now, is this concept of events in S3. So with S3 events, you can get notified whenever objects are created, whenever they're modified, whenever they're deleted, whenever they're replicated. There's a whole bunch of other ones as well, but I think those are the main ones. Now with that in mind, we can do some very interesting things. So whenever a batch of data gets delivered to our S3 bucket, we can trigger an event to invoke a Lambda function. And that Lambda function will get invoked, and inside the event that is passed into that Lambda function will be the bucket name and the object key that was created. We can code up our Lambda function in such a way that we can go and pull that S3 object, maybe do some data processing, some data aggregation, maybe some filtering or whatever you want to do, and then maybe put that processed data back into S3, or maybe even store it in a database elsewhere for indexing purposes. So you can do a whole bunch of stuff with S3 events by integrating it with AWS Lambda. S3 and Lambda is a very, very useful integration that you can really do all sorts of different things. All right, so that's a data ingestion pipeline. Let's talk now about analytics and dashboarding. So say we have a customer and we have our S3 bucket that's containing just a whole bunch of JSON files. Maybe we have JSON events, maybe for a credit card transactions. We have a credit card application that is just keeping track of whenever people make purchases, refunds, whatever it may be. So say we have all this data in JSON in our S3 bucket, and we want to do some analytics on that data, but we don't really want to put it in a database because, databases cost money, ones that aren't serverless at least, but we still want to be able to do some complex, SQL style queries on that data. So what we can do is we can leverage Amazon Athena. And Amazon Athena is an analytics service that integrates directly with S3, and it allows you to do SQL style queries on all the content within your bucket, provided all that content conforms to a very similar schema. So this is a completely serverless model. So you can, once configured, you can go into Athena, do all your SQL queries. No servers are being provisioned. All of that is done for you behind the scenes. I believe it uses Hadoop or EMR behind the scenes to actually do this, if you're curious. But Athena runs basically on a pay-per-use model, so you get all the advantages of being able to perform data analytics without having to worry about provisioning and maintaining a database, and better yet, you get to store all of that data in S3 and you never need to transform it or move it elsewhere. All of this kind of hooks in natively. So that's great for analytics, a really good option. And in terms of dashboarding, you can hook up Amazon QuickSight to S3. So you can do stuff similar to what you would do in something like Tableau. You can create histograms, you can create charts, tables that integrate directly with the data that is stored in S3 with just some simple configuration on the QuickSight side. So that's it in terms of analytics and dashboarding. Now I want to talk about event-driven architectures as well. This is another very useful application of using S3. So similarly, we also have a customer, and in this example, it's a image uploading application. So we're going to be uploading raw images to an S3 bucket from the customer perspective, and we want to process that image. Maybe we want to do pixel detection or even machine learning or something like that. So we can upload that content to S3. We can set up a S3 put event to trigger a Lambda function. That Lambda function can go back and pull that image out, do whatever it needs to do that pixel analysis or whatever it may need to do. And then from there, we can notify the customer using a GraphQL application hosted through AWS AppSync. And this leverages like a pub/sub model with WebSockets behind the scenes. So we can broadcast a message back to our original customer telling them that their processed image is ready for download. So this is another toy example of how you can integrate with other AWS services to do some very, very sophisticated things. So those are some examples. Now I just want to close it out by talking about pricing, because this is something that does matter. There's a lot of different options that exist that are alternatives to AWS, but pricing is a very attractive feature of S3. So the TLDR of pricing is that it's basically dependent on those storage classes that we were talking about earlier. Now, it's not like completely dependent. The costs are very reasonable in general, but it kind of moves up and down depending on the storage class that you want to use. Now, in general, there's three main factors that contribute to how much you're going to be paying in terms of using S3. The first one is storage. The more data you store, the more you pay. It's as simple as that. The second one is in terms of access. The more often you are trying to access your data, either by a get or a post, so getting or updating data or uploading data, you're going to be charged more. Makes sense? The third one is transfer. This one can be kind of a hidden cost that most people don't really think about. Transferring is the notion of pulling your data out of S3 through the public internet down to maybe your dev box or to your application system. This can bite you if you don't pay attention to it, so just keep that in mind when you're running through some scenarios of predicting your costs when you're using S3. So this wasn't really useful in the sense of giving you an idea of how much it's going to cost. So I wanted to give you an example of what a hypothetical scenario may look like. So say we have this scenario here. We have 100 gigabytes of storage, we have 10,000 put requests, and we have 10,000 read requests. Now keep in mind, this is occurring on a monthly basis. Now, how much would this cost across the different storage classifications or the storage tiers? Well, if we're using the standard tier, this comes out to $676 a month. Pretty reasonable cost based on the amount of data and the access patterns and the transfer in and out. Oh, by the way, all of the examples here are assuming that you're going to be transferring out 50 gigabytes of data through the public internet down to a machine, maybe your home machine or an application machine. The transfer cost is a large portion of the total cost, so just keep that in mind when you're looking at these numbers. If you're not expected to transfer your data very often, then this number is going to be a lot lower. Now, with the same example with the infrequent access tier, it's only $627 a month. A minor, drop, but not insignificant, I would say. And if you have archive data that you're not going to be accessing very often, then that would be under the Glacier tier, and that'll cost you $564 a month. Now keep in mind, this is assuming that transfer cost constraint. Your prices are going to be way, way lower if you're not accessing this data very often and you're not pulling it down through the public internet. So just keep that in mind. So if it's your first time getting started with AWS, you may want to kind of tinker with it without having to pay anything. And the good news for you is that Amazon S3 supports free tier, and free tier comes with 5 gigabytes worth of standard tier data. And you get 20,000 GET requests and 2,000 PUT requests absolutely free every month. Now keep in mind, this only applies for the first 12 months of your account. After that, you're going to be charged just the standard pricing model, but this gives you a good opportunity to experiment with S3, maybe try out some different integrations and get familiar with it overall. So I'm going to be doing a follow-up video to this where I'm going to walk you through the AWS console and some of the different topics that we discussed here. I'll put that as a pop-up on the right when it's available. And in the meantime, check out the videos on the left for more on S3. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.